Hello and welcome to Identity Management class. Of course, as always, you're going to have a knowledge check. You'll have some exercises for some of the weeks. Weekly discussion. It's been great so far, so keep at it. And of course, then we have this class session as well. You will see this diagram over and over again because I think it is such a great diagram, and to me, it sort of takes our traditional view of authorities, like what we would think of authorities from the library standpoint, and brings it sort of up to a more modern view of identities, especially as we start talking about attributes of identities being characteristics and identifiers and things like that. So if you go out and to start looking at more institutional repository or digital library projects, or you're starting to look at more semantic web concepts, you're going to see this notion of may depend upon the project, you may see the concept of identities. They may also use some of the library terminology. They may use names. They may use some other, verbiage to kind of indicate an identity, but then you will frequently see this notion of attributes as characteristics. And depending upon what community you're in and how that community approaches it, it may be very much tied to linked data, where it's tied to a data source and you're just including the URI in your particular data. And in that case, then it would probably be focused really on looking at things that are more identifier oriented. So what are the unique identifiers kinds of things? But I do really like this because I feel like it kind of breaks out the sort of more traditional, as I said, the more traditional view of identities and libraries as authorities, and it kind of does make it feel a little bit modern. So we'll see this over and over again as we talk about these things because it's so good. Before we kind of dive into really talking about the challenges and some of the aspects of identity management that are unique from other parts of our data, I do want to talk a little bit about good practices in data as a whole. So these apply to all kinds of data situations, really, I would say all data situations. We want our data to be interoperable. So we want our data to be able to work with other pieces of data or other systems. For example, if you have a calendar, maybe you have a calendar that you use to do events, or you have your calendar that you're using to set reminders for yourself or whatever. You want it to be interoperable so that you can use it on your phone or you can use it on your computer, or maybe you want it to be interoperable with your work calendar because it's a personal calendar. We want interoperability, and these days more than ever, we want interoperability, right? We want to be able to ask our smart devices to do whatever, and we don't want them to be met by a barrier. Now maybe you want your smart devices to do that. Maybe you don't. You're like, no, absolutely not. I don't want it in my business. And that's the other piece of it too. We all have things that we're comfortable with doing in terms of our data. And just as we're kind of talking through these things and thinking about data and thinking about how data should be used, even though these things are good practices from a data standpoint, like we want our data to be interoperable, we don't want it to have barriers between it. We want our data to be modular, to where it's broken down into standard units so that we can use it in different ways. Just because these things are good for data doesn't necessarily mean that they're good for people. And I think that's a really important distinction, especially as we continue down this road of starting to have some very serious conversations, especially as we're seeing more and more data being collected about us and being shared, sometimes without our permission, sometimes with our permission. Sometimes you have no choice. If you want to use this product, you must sign the terms of service, right? If you don't sign that, check that box, so you can't use that software. So we are kind of forced into that. If you want to use whatever phone you've you have, if you want to use that phone, you really have to agree to the terms of service from that particular company. So we don't sometimes have, we are kind of forced into the corner where we don't have as much choice as we might like. So that's one of the things, as we're talking about privacy and as we're talking about the ethics of users and creators, and especially focusing on creators, then I do want us to think also carefully about sort of our own views of what we want to do with our data. There are people who are very comfortable with sharing their data with whoever, they probably don't want their financial data and their personally identifiable data shared with everyone. But other than that, it's like, there's no privacy. It doesn't exist. Everybody has my data, whatever, and they're much more open about what they want to share and feel comfortable with. There are other people who are, very much of, I don't want to share anything. I try to, have as minimal footprint as I can. Then there's other people who maybe were kind of a little bit like me, where were out there a lot more, and now they're trying to kind of pull back a little bit and try to rein in some of the use of data. And to be honest, once it's out there, it is kind of out there, but there is such a thing as digital rot, and sometimes it's useful. So, while these things are good for data, they're not necessarily good for people. And that's something to kind of think about as we're kind of talking through some data practices, and especially when we look next week at other communities of practice and how they handle identities. I want you to kind of think about that in the back of your head and think about, is this good for our resource creators? Is this good for the people who help make the books and the videos and the movies? And if I don't, there's probably a library somewhere that's collecting TikToks and all kinds of social media stuff. And I know there's all kinds of digital content being collected by libraries and archives. So, is this good for those people who are creating those resources or have a hand in creating those resources? Is how this particular community handles identities, is that a good practice? And it's not an easy thing to make a decision on, in my opinion, because there's so many aspects of it. And in terms of balancing the needs of the users, but balancing the needs of findability and ease of access versus, trying to even sometimes figure out, should I include this data? Would this person want me to include this data? It's easy if you can ask the person and they tell you. If you can't do that, then it's I think much more of a nuanced conversation to have and to think about, when you're actually working on these materials, especially when you start getting to special collections material, digitized material, archival material, things that may be being collected about events or happenings, history that's kind of living history that's happening now where people are still alive, then we start seeing some real conversations about what kind of data to include. So these are good practices of data management as a whole. Interoperability, we want to be able to use data back and forth. We want it broken down into units. We're starting to see data being broken down more within our records and within our data. And as we move forward looking at other ways to model our data, especially library data, looking at BibFrame and looking at knowledge graphs, which really explodes the whole concept of how we break data down, we are really going to start to see more modularity, but it's going to be a while till we get to more modularity. Extensibility, being able to increase the scope or range. Certainly if we are using linked data, if instead of typing in a person's name, we're linking to a data source for that person's identity, then if we ever get to the point where there's a tipping point and most of us are linking to a data source, then in theory, those who are maintaining that data source, and hopefully it would be a group of people, and we're all kind of contributing like we do with the name authority file, then if we continue to do that, then we could possibly have more robust records or more information in records, or maybe at some point we get away from, as far as the National Authority file, the Library of Congress National Authority file, maybe at some point we get away from a MARC record that's a flat file, and we can actually do things like embed video and images and all kinds of stuff into those, into that presence, that data source, so that not only are you linking to that particular entry about that person, but it could pull in some of that value added content that may be of interest. So certainly extensibility, while a good data practice as a whole, when we start looking at what linked data could do for us, you know, at a large scale, we would have to get to the point where there's enough people who are able to not manage their local data. So you'd have to share enough data and then have enough collaborators at that national authority file level or Wikidata, whatever source it was, so that, you know, there's enough people maintaining the data on the other side, then we could get to more extensible resources as far as that. And of course, these days we are seeing an exponential rise in the need to move forward with migration, system migrations. Upgrades are happening more frequently. If you're an ex-Libris client and you're working in Alma, you get a monthly update to the ILS every month. It may be minor, it may be small, it may be big, who knows? It depends upon what they're working on, but it is a monthly update. So we're definitely starting to see change of our platforms happening at a much quicker rate, which of course then means at some point that system dies, or that system maybe is not getting as much updates, or it's just not as modern as it could be, or you find a different system, or it's too expensive, or whatever reason it may be, but you need to get out of that system and move to something else. So the ability to move data from one system to another to be portable. And certainly with identity management, again, if we were linking to identity sources versus having maybe our own version of an authority file, which some libraries and institutions do, you know, then again, we wouldn't have to deal with migrating all of that data or fixing broken links or anything like that, because we would be linking out to a centralized data source. The other thing I want you to think about as we're talking about identities, and really as we start, you know, kind of talking more about how different communities of practice deal with identities, also is the potential issues that we encounter with data. Now, these four, and there's probably more, but these are just sort of 4 general buckets of issues with data. They happen to all kinds of data across all kinds of platforms and industries. There's not anything, and you may look at it and think, well, yeah, that's true, because there's not really anything interesting here. This has been our reality for a long time. Anyone who works with data or searches, you know, well, that was missing, or there's not enough information to make a decision. It was confusing. You know, the data's wrong. They got my name wrong. They got my address wrong. Um, they have my family listed as somebody else, or whatever it may be. You know, we deal with all of these, even with our personal data, but certainly we see these across, you know, any data landscape. And as we start looking at communities of practice and how they handle specific names, we'll look, you know, do some comparisons. And that is one of the things to kind of think about too, is, you know, what information that they're presenting about a person and how they're handling that particular information. So we'll be talking more about that as we look at the various platforms, but we'll kind of touch on this as we go through this class, because this is such an important piece of identity management, and something frankly we've really struggled with, at least in libraries, because so much of the time our identities that are listed in those records and that data is a text string, and it's in a locally hosted, locally downloaded record. So the system's often local, the record's often local, and the entry for that person's name or subject or whatever it is often just a text string. It is just somebody's name typed in there. Now, yes, we follow standardized formats, and we may go out to the Library of Congress name authority file and look to see what that appropriate name is, and we type that in, but still, it's a text string in a locally downloaded record that's on a locally hosted system. Now, some libraries have already broken that connection between a locally hosted system, and so their system is cloud-based and hosted elsewhere. So that breaks a little bit of that and starts providing opportunities for more of this. So, we have traditionally struggled a lot with this, because if you have a locally hosted record on a locally hosted system, be it an ILS or an institutional repository or digital archive or whatever it is, finding aids, whatever it may be, that means somebody has to go in and fix those records if something changes. So it is very much on the staff in the library to maintain all of that authority or identity data. And in this particular class, we're really only focused on the identity data. But if you're in that situation where you have locally hosted data on a locally hosted system, and it's up to the staff, you don't outsource it, it's up to the staff to actually do that work, then you're also doing that for your controlled vocabularies, like your subject headings as well. So just doing that work is probably several full-time jobs, depending upon how many records you actually have. And of course, nobody has time to kind of take that on as dedicated staff. Now, if you're in a larger library, maybe you have some dedicated staff, but I guarantee you it's still not enough to do all this work. So even in libraries that have more resources and who dedicate staffing to this, we have a tendency to start slipping when it comes to maintenance work. And that's just the reality of what we do. And nowhere do we see that problem more than with subject maintenance and name maintenance. But subjects, sometimes those can be a little bit easier to do, sometimes not. Names, again, it really depends upon whether or not you can outsource any of that, or you can use a tool like MARCedit or something else to do some of that work. But we see all of those challenges with identities. Of course, there's so many challenges to even establishing or creating an identity. So traditionally in library speak, sort of in the authority landscape, when we talk about identities and we talk about authorities, so identities and authorities being the same thing, I say authorities, you say identities, it's the same thing. We're talking about managing the identity of person. Authorities from the library standpoint also throws in subjects. So it does throw in that other piece of it too, but not all librarians who do authorities do subjects. There are some librarians, and I've been in this situation a couple of times now, where I was contributing to the name authority file for names only, but I was not doing subjects, because that goes through a different process and you have different training for that and all that. And although I have worked with those subjects and I teach classification and subject analysis and controlled vocabularies, I've never been formally approved to contribute to that particular process. I've made recommendations for subjects, but I've not actually sat on that committee and participated in that process in that way. Names I have added, so that piece of it I've done. And in that community, we have called creating a name and establishing a name, because we are establishing what that formal representation of that name will be in our data. And this will be data depending upon where we create the data. It may be data that we're creating locally, or it's going to be data that will be in the national authority file or maybe Wikidata, but we're creating that data somewhere. And this idea of verifying or establishing or creating an identity, we've been doing it for a little while in libraries. Well, probably for more than a little while, but for a while in libraries. But it is a rather modern construct as a whole. So as a culture, we did not really think to do this for a while. So for example, when you start looking at, you do ancestry, maybe start looking at your family history. This is my mom's side of the family. We are Shelton, Heltons, Hiltons. I forget the other ones, Houghton. There's a whole bunch. Welton, Shelton, Elton. All of these names are variations of my mom's side of the family's maternal side of her family's name. So when when my mom was doing genealogy and I've been kind of helping her and stuff, we can see the shift when we're looking at what documentation exists in terms of how families split. The Shelton and Helton's pretty easy to see. You just see somebody just drop the S, that just happened at some point. But it is very easy to see. But the thing is, when you start looking at documentation and you start looking at especially historical patterns of identity management. For one, we didn't really have identity management as we have now, where it's very centralized. Instead, it was more whatever the person said they were, or whoever the person said they were is what was represented. So you also had things like literacy coming into play, how literate a particular person was. Could the people, people answering the census right? Did they know how to spell their name, or where did that information come from? If you grew up in a household where you were told that you were Helton and previously the grandmother had been Shelton, then suddenly you've become a Helton. So when we start looking at especially historical names, we start looking at the history of names, it gets very interesting very quickly. And I would say every family probably has this. If you start looking at your family names and the relationship of the names and the sort of the naming conventions. And then we have other communities where names completely shifted entirely. There are some Native American ancestors on my mother's side as well, and they actually, which is very unusual, but the male folks who married into the line actually took the name of Helton at that time. They actually took the name of Helton and took a different version of their name. So they actually changed their name from Cherokee to what would be a more probably at that time acceptable name. So then we start having, and of course there's other communities within the United States and everywhere that has had to either change their name or take the name. And of course we haven't even talked about gender and women taking the name of their husbands and all that kind of stuff. But we have this whole long line where people have changed their names at times, and some of that does not get properly documented, especially in olden times. So when you start looking at historical resources and trying to establish or determine a person's identity, it starts getting very, very tricky very quickly. And so for those of you working with archival material, digital humanities material, family histories, any of that kind of stuff, you probably will start encountering some questions about identities or what that name actually should be along the way. So, identities are so much more complex besides just what the name is. Certainly, historically, we just sort of took the person at their, what they said their name was is what got written down in the census, or what got written down in the documentation, or got written down in the marriage certificate. We just kind of took it at that. But we use identities, especially these days, for so many different things. And we increasingly are relying on our identity as that way to interact and get things like, that maybe it's tied to your key card, or we're using it to get some government services, or maybe we're using it for our mobile devices. And this can include biometric data too. So it can be our eyes, it can be our handprints, our thumbprints, it can be all of those kind of qualities about us that go into these identities. Now, a lot of that biometric information hopefully is under lock and key and very carefully guarded, because it's some of the last data that is kind of unique to us, that's not out in the wild. And of course, we look at how we identify people for historical purposes, especially when we're working with those archival materials. And then of course, we also use identities when we're doing statistical kind of research, and the government uses identities, how many people in this particular category that we've constructed did this, or how many people moved, or how many people bought a house, or ages, or what do millennials think, or whatever it may be. We use those characteristics or those attributes of identities all the time to group together people to make these broad sorts of analysis about our culture. So we've talked some about the challenges of identity management in terms of, not being able to find information. We talked a little bit about sort of those broad categories of problems with data. And as I said, you will see these with identity management. So, data varies across the platforms, certainly throughout time, right? The older the name is, the less likely it is to have official or formal documentation. If you've done any kind of historical or family research, that it gets spotty the older you go, and it may depend upon what county has something, what state has something, what country has something, in terms of how much information is collected. It may also depend upon what the status of that particular person was during that time and how they were counted. So depending upon what the legal status was of that particular identity, or depending upon how that person was viewed, they may not be named at all in a sentence. They may just be listed as, plus one child, or, two slaves, or whatever it may be. They may have no real representation as an identity within that particular documentation as even an individual. They may just be counted in kind of a group. So, we encounter so much, especially when we start looking at historical evidence for identities, but it really goes back to that insufficient information. We start looking at it from a data side. And I don't think we can really separate out the emotional aspect, because we are talking about dealing with people, and even groups of people. Even if you start talking about an organization or a corporation or the government, we think about those as sort of these anonymous bodies. I mean, yes, we know who the president is, and who some of maybe who our local commissioners are, and that kind of thing, but we don't necessarily know all the people that work in the government, or we don't know all the people that work in a library, or we don't know all the people at Random House, or whatever it may be. But if we start thinking about those institutions, they are truly just groups of people working together on the behalf of a nonprofit, on the behalf of a government, on behalf of a corporation, a true corporation, one that makes money. But how they may be reflected within those particular organizations, they may be invisible. So, it does make identity management, when we start looking at things like attributes of a particular person, it does make those things really challenging in terms of how much information we may have access to. And of course, as I said here, even handwriting can be hard to decipher. If you've ever looked at any old ship manifest or any older documentation, you know that even the handwriting can make it hard to determine what a person's name is, and how they view themselves. So here's just a little snapshot. This is from the Belgian American website, and it's from a ship manifest of Belgian immigrants. And they list some of the attributes of those particular people. They list the name, their relationship, and their age, and their occupation. And you'll see here, for example, from a data standpoint, we just have farmer, and then we have sort of the, it's the same all the way down until we get to, I believe that says mother. I would have to zoom in a little bit closer, but we didn't even, in this case, they didn't even enter the data in all the way through in each field. We see blanks and we see these quotation marks to indicate it's the same as it was above. Now, it's the same as it was above in terms of a data point is useless. I mean, it's just, data does not see itself that way. So when we start looking at how we break data down, if we were to digitize this and we wanted to actually put it all into data points, someone would have to go in and say, well, in this case, lines 1 through 5 are all farmer. And so we need to add or enrich that data to add that farmer information in. But again, this is very hard to read, and you see here some ink blobs. I mean, who knows what that says? It is hard to read and decipher for sure. We don't always count data the same. So when we start looking at insufficient data or incomplete data or confusing data, we have not even within the census. And of course, how would we know really what to count? And data evolves and all of that kind of thing. Yes, that's great. It's a great concept in terms of data evolving, and we can collect more data, we can do more granular things. But the fact that we sort of change how we record information. For example, in 1960, well, for several years, there was no other category. 1960, well, I guess 1960, there was no other category. And then we did not start collecting Hawaiian and Pacific Islander till 2000 census. So if you were from Hawaii and you identified as Hawaiian, then you would, kind of have to put yourself in another bucket. Maybe you were other, maybe, but there wasn't other for 1960. So what do? You have to stick yourself in some bucket. So, that's the other thing too. Not collecting data consistency means that data gets squished together in ways that can make it challenging in establishing identities or make it challenging in terms of trying to remediate the data. Let's say we were doing a digitization project and we're using census data as the basis for some kind of data and identity project. We would hit some real trouble spots here with what to do with the fact that we're not recording information consistently across the years. And we have, at least the one census where, other than very early on, but we have one census in kind of the middle where we are not allowing that use of other. And so if people don't identify with these particular categories, we have forced them to choose a category that does not belong to them or that they do not identify with. And so when we have identity and we are asked to provide our identity, especially for something formal and official like the census, but for any kind of form that we're filling out. Now, there's also prefer not to say is often added these days, and that gives people an opt-out. I kind of choose that a lot myself just because I prefer to give less data, but that's just me. But at the same time, there should also be the other category in case I do want to say, but none of these categories you provided me are what I identify as or what I know myself to be. So the more granular we get is great, but then if we try to compare that data to data that does not have that granularity, then it really is not going to be a accurate comparison, because some of the data would have just been squished in or maybe just not provided at all. if you were, maybe you didn't fill out the census completely because you got to that box and said, well, I don't fit into any of those categories and there's none others, so I'm not going to fill it out. And, maybe you did the rest of it and that kind of went through and nobody followed up. And so that was it. That data was completely missed. So, that is one of the things that happens, especially with identity management, is how we have traditionally over the years, and of course, this is just United States, but when you start looking across the world, it's very similar in terms of the data that's collected about people and how that data is used. And then if we are using that data in some ways or trying to use that as a data source, then we may encounter issues with that data or make assumptions about that data that we really can't make because there is missing data or that data has been sort of falsely collapsed or combined together in ways that it really shouldn't be. So this is just one very small instance here in terms of looking at death records. So death records in the United States, death records across the world are handled differently. So we start looking at global data, things get, very different across the world. But just looking at the state of Georgia, death rates are recorded in some counties beginning in 1875, but not all counties. Statewide was established in 1919. So, that's a 20, almost a 45-year gap, 44-year gap. But they were not forced to actually do it until 1928. So, even having sort of a process in place for collecting identities or collecting this part of the identities, what the death would be, what the death date would be, is not consistent just within this one state. And then on top of that, if you start looking at really rural communities or religious communities or those that may not follow a traditional or what would be seen as a traditional process, would not follow what the state process is for recording death information, then, that's a whole nother category of those attributes of particular people that are not going to be recorded in a way that would be helpful. Now, how does this impact all of us when we are working with identities? Well, certainly if you're trying to verify or check someone's death date or determine if there is a death date for that person, or maybe you're trying to determine their birth date, or maybe there's additional information that you want to include about that person. So maybe you're trying to confirm that what you are seeing, what the resource that you are working on that you're trying to describe, maybe you're trying to match those identities together. And so you're looking at death date, you're looking at birth date, you're trying to figure out, is my James Helton the same as yours, James Helton? Very common kind of name. Are they the same? And you're looking at time period that they've lived, and maybe that's even close too. So you're trying to determine, are these the same people? Can this identity be linked to my resource? Or if not, do I need to create a new resource? Do I need to disambiguate those resources? Because I don't want to add to the National Authority file or Wikidata or whatever identity source that I'm working in. I would not want to make it more confusing by creating two names that are the same, but for two different people. I want them to be disambiguated, to be separate entities, to be separate identities. So there's a lot that goes into identities that really gets to how complex they are, especially when we start looking at people who lived and created content before sort of modern standards. But there's also all kinds of communities that, even looking through sort of a modern lens, there are certainly communities that do not participate in what might be a state process or a national process, within a country or within a, a particular community. And then when you start looking at smaller countries and maybe countries that are still sort of organizing their data collection processes, they may be a little bit more like the United States was kind of earlier on in terms of centralizing what that identity process looks like. And so when we start looking at global data, as I mentioned already, we start looking at global data, things get very different from community to community and from country to country, and you know, really varies a lot. And so assumptions that we may make about identities in terms of whether or not the information matches, in terms of whether or not that person is the same, if we need to establish identities, whether or not we have the information to do so, you know, we may need to understand more about where that person is situated in time and within society to determine what resources we may be able to find to prove that person's identity or to sort out if we have a potential conflict. Collecting data has a lot of variations in practice, as you can tell there. And, as hopefully this is you're already kind of thinking about how much this variation of data then causes that uncertainty in data. So we have all of that happens. And of course, that's all predicated on, this, even though it's uncertain data, at least it is data, right? So we have all this data that's collected or not collected. And then, of course, the other side of it is then that role of the privacy and the ethics of dealing with that data. And this is to me an increasingly challenge within our modern times because of course data is created about us all the time, right? And every time we sign one of these terms of service and the little privacy policy pops up and you sign it and you check the box so you can use your phone or your new computer, or you can download some music or stream or whatever it is you're doing, read a book online, anything that you have to sign or check a box to do. There is a terms of service and a privacy policy associated with it. Terms of service is how you can use that particular resource. And sometimes it touches a little bit upon what they'll do with your data, but the privacy policy is really what covers what they will do with your data. We don't really ask resource contributors to sign any kind of terms of service with us or any kind of privacy policy or even a usage or rates policy or anything related to the use of their name or data in terms of how we work with our resource creators. We are starting to really think about more what we do with that data and what's the best way to handle it. Because we have made a lot of assumptions, some of which were very valid when we were first started doing identity work and authorities work. But in this digital age, it's becoming increasingly less so, I think. And, I pulled this from a resource just a few days ago, but about 62% of the world's total population is an internet active user. So that really is about 62% of the world's population has signed some sort of terms of service or privacy policy to use whatever software, whatever device, whatever kind of computer they're using. If they're on the internet, they have an internet server provider. Maybe they're running their own thing, but if they're running their own thing, they're using some kind of equipment or technology. If you use Starlink and you do satellite internet, you've signed a terms of service and privacy policy with Starlink. If you do Xfinity or whatever it may be, your particular broadband or internet provider may be, there's a terms of service associated with that. So, this piece of it, I think from a larger standpoint is really the thing that we just don't talk enough about, because we are kind of in that spot where if you want to use your phone, If you want to use your computer, if you want to get on the internet, you've got to do this thing. You've got to sign it. And so I think that's why people just kind of check the box and move on, is because there's not really a choice to opt out. Now, there are real concerns, and we're starting to have these concerns about privacy. And the concerns are starting to increase. And I think part of it is we're starting to see the impact of what happens when this data gets released. People start seeing identity theft being on the rise. When I worked at a major university, like all of our personal information got put on it was publicly available, but it was not published in a way that you would just find it through Google. But certainly if you knew how to find things on the internet, you could find it. And we're talking about our entire everything, from our salaries to, our personal identifiers to where our office, it was all of our information, all of it. So of course we have a letter and, all of it. Here's what happened. If you have any problems, here's your proof that this happened to you, kind of stuff. But, that doesn't really protect you from identity theft. It just says to your credit card company or whoever, if you have a problem, here's the proof that you didn't do it. Here's the proof that you do not owe however, many thousands of dollars that this hacker may have gotten out of you. So, I think we are starting to have some real good conversations, at least surrounding how to protect our identities a little bit from identity theft. But this really focuses more on all of us as users and consumers of these resources and products. It doesn't really focus on our content creators or even the staff in our building so much. It's very much about our users. So when our users log in or come into the library to get a library card, or maybe they log into the institutional repository so that they can do something or look at something, or even the cookies that are used to track them, as they're doing things so that their searches are saved or whatever, all of that data that's collected, typically, even if we kind of just check the box and move on, we at least are warned that our data is being used. But we don't do the same thing for the people that create the content and the resources that we collect. So our focus has really been on our users, not only the users of our software and all of that kind of stuff, users who come into the building and get a library card or a museum application or whatever it may be. But we just really haven't focused too much on those content creators. And this really falls into that very traditional model of identity management that we talked about in week 1, where it's all about the users, it's all about authentication, it's all about whether or not they understand the terms of service of what's happening with their data and what the privacy policy is regarding their data. Terms of service also usually covers whether or not you still own the content that you create. So I would always say to people to read the terms of service for social media, even if it's long and boring and all of that, because if you're creating content on that platform, you sure want to know who owns it, right? We do, as libraries, we have several sort of checkpoints, I think. We have the Library Bill of Rights, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. You'll have it here. You can read through it because it really talks through some very specific library related scenarios. But again, it's focused on users. It's focused on user access, and it's focused on confidentiality. So it's focused on protecting the users and providing resources to those users. It's not focused on content creators at all. And in fact, content creators are not even really mentioned in this at all. And I'm not saying they should be mentioned here, but maybe they should be. But I think that, it's really more about services and sort of facilities and equipment and less sort of about the data itself. There's also an ALA privacy policy in the Code of Ethics, which I've linked to, and that talks a little bit more about user data and not disclosing user data and that kind of thing. Again, it is very focused on that traditional view of identity management, that it is about users and how users interact with us and what we do with their data, that they are safe, that they're in a safe space with us. Giving you a lot more examples to look through. Feel free to look through any of these that are of interest to you. We're not going to really spend too much time talking about that, other than there's examples. More examples. I've given you a lot of different kinds of examples for a lot of different kinds of scenarios. So you can take a look at any of those that are interest. Just a couple of things to point out here, and I gave you the link down here too. The privacy policy does, or guidelines do very much talk about access to personal data. Again, that is really talking about the users. It doesn't talk about the library staff who work in the buildings, and it does not talk about our content creators. I like this diagram. This one is, it kind of talks about the degrees of identifiability, whether or not you can identify someone. It talks about sort of protections and talks about how to de-identify data and make data anonymous. Now, from a user standpoint, this is a very important piece of, you know, there's sort of a group of identities that we deal with in a different way. But I think this piece of it, thinking about their privacy, is useful. But again, then this balances with what they need or want to do. If every interaction that I have with the ILS is anonymous, then and my circulation records are not kept. So as soon as I turn something in, it vanishes. Then if I want to know, let's say, did I read that book last month? Can you tell me that? Guess what? Can't tell you that. Can you make a reading list of everything that I read when, I was a teen, because I'd like to share that with my niece now, and I've lived here my whole life, so you should have that. We can't tell you that. So, there are times where there is a little bit of a tension between what we want to do with our data and how much protection we may want to provide people. And certainly, as we're talking through the identity management part of it, we're talking about our content creators. We have focused on this degrees of identifiable. We want them identified so that our users can find their resources by these creators, and to be able to, do searches by women authors of the 18th century or whatever it may be. We want people to be able to do that. But now, especially, at least in the United States, there's also been some discussions about not only subjects that may identify particular works and demographic groups, but also, what we should do in terms of protecting identities. So we are starting to see some discussions, maybe moving us a little bit, at least for specific situations, of whether or not we want to have our content creators completely on the identifiable side. We have content creators listed in our data. We try to make sure that you can find all the works by that particular person. And especially as there's been some division within the United States, but within other countries that happens as well, there is that tension between providing identifiable information about people versus somewhere in the middle, maybe a little bit less identifiable. And we'll be talking more about that in just a second, versus completely anonymous. And I do know of at least one situation from a colleague that I talked to last year, who had a request from an author to remove the name completely from the data. Now, true, the name still appears on the book. The author did not request to have the name removed from the book or marked out or anything like that, but to remove it from the data. I do not know the reason why, but that was the request. And so, we did have a little bit of discussion about what the options were and what to do in that situation. But I think as people are becoming more aware of data concerns, we may see more of those kinds of things. But we're certainly starting to talk a little bit about identification versus de-identification and what attributes of a person's identity should we maybe protect or omit as sort of a layer of protection. I think one of the things that we're starting to look at is, how not only governments, but institutions, organizations, things like that. Libraries have sort of had that leading role, I think, in many ways in protecting the user data, but we've not had that same role in other aspects. The EU has taken a leading role in privacy, and they're actually sort of trying to force social media companies to change what they do with our data. They call the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, the toughest privacy and security law in the world. It was drafted and passed in 2018. It imposes significant fines on social media companies who do not, and other companies. It's not just social media, but some of the biggest companies in social media have paid extraordinary sums of money because they are unwilling to meet the needs of protecting data or controlling the data in terms of, data about people. The United States is a hodgepodge of state and federal laws. Of course, if you're in a country or organization that may have additional restrictions, there are some organizations and countries that are very tight in terms of what they allow in terms of social media or in terms of what they allow access at all. And there are the pros and cons to all of that. But in terms of, sometimes it's a security issue, sometimes it's a control of information issue, sometimes it's a control of whatever. So lots of reasons that happens. Sometimes it's concerns over safety of data or whatever it may be. But at least in the United States, privacy is kind of a hodgepodge of state. There are some states that have much stronger rules. California has been sort of leading the effort in this way and has passed some legislation that is similar. They kind of tout themselves as being like the EU in terms of data protection. And if you look at, if you're in a website, especially like a shopping website or some kind of website like that, sometimes you'll see at the bottom California residents, and it'll be a little link. And that's because either there's some additional requirements that particular company had to meet in order to can be used by California residents, or there may be even a different form that California residents fill out, or maybe California residents can't participate because, that particular corporation is not willing to meet the needs of protecting the privacy according to that particular law. I haven't read the ins and outs of all of these laws dealing with privacies. I've just read some summaries, but at least we're having this conversation. Which I think is a very important conversation. And frankly, it's long overdue. So getting back to our creators, because really that's kind of the heart of what we're talking about in this particular class. Creators are really in a unique role because, of course, if you're creating something, if you're writing a book, if you're writing a journal article, if you blog publicly, then you probably have a public role associated with that resource that a library is creating. So you know, we collect a lot of that stuff, commercially published books, uh, magazines, journals, any of that kind of stuff. If we pay for it and it comes through a commercial publication, then there has been some vetting process and some contracts signed with those creators, those writers, those illustrators, those editors. So that's sort of one category of identities where there has been a contract established with that creator where they've decided what their name's going to be. They've provided whatever information they want to provide. They've named their particular resource. They've agreed to whatever guidelines that publisher has put in place for them, and they have actually signed a contract. So that material in some ways is much easier to deal with, because I think we can take the information that comes from the publisher and as presented from the creator or contributor, we can sort of take that resource and that creator's presentation of themselves sort of as is evidence for use in identity management. Where we really get to be, I think, in a challenging spot is when we start digitizing things that belong to personal collections or things where people may have been included without their explicit permission. So thinking about the Women's March or any of the marches that have happened in the last, say, 20 years, people being involved in activism or, I mean, even things that they might have been kind of embarrassed to do, maybe not activism, just they went to a party and then somebody had those party photographs and then they got digitized as part of some archive because the person donated them, the person's family donated them when that person died. Any of those kind of things where we've not been given permission, we're not asked for permission a lot of times, and thus we've not given permission to be included in those resources. And then for someone to try to identify us and perhaps link us to our professional identity or whatever it may be. I'm just making these case studies up, people. So there are no party photos of me, at least none that I know. But it can create a really sticky situation. And sometimes we kind of chuckle when something comes out, or it's kind of like, oh my gosh, did you see that? These things that may come out. But then other times, if we're the one creating the data and we're the one describing the resource, especially for these archival materials, I do think we need to have that discussion, or at least that sort of review and kind of think about whether or not what we're doing is going to cause harm or problems for the people we're going to identify. And to think very ethically, especially when we're working on materials that are not commercially published, things that are more archival in nature, things like that, that we do need to have that conversation. Now, for public personas, it is a little bit different because, of course, they're out in public and they've sort of, maybe they've made a statement. And if they were famous or had a public persona before they had some changes to their particular identity, then, a lot of times there's things under that old name and things under that new name. And so Elliot Page is actually a really good example of this, because Elliot's gender and name changed in late 2022, early 2021. It was, of course, a transition kind of period. And, one of the things to think about is how much that public persona and what that person has to say should come into our view of trying to describe this person or create identity documentation about this person. If we're going to create a record, identity record of this person, what information would we include and how would we approach it, since we know very publicly and there is documentation that exists publicly telling us sort of what happened, why it happened, although the dates are a little bit squishy, but we have a pretty good timeline of what happened. So of course, when we look at Elliot's data, their identity data as a whole, we look at user generated data. So this would be their user accounts, answers when they fill out demographic information. Well, that information changed, right? Password and security questions. Hopefully password and security questions are private and secure, but all that data that we create, that's part of that user generated data, where we create some data about ourselves. And this data was typically be created in the course of, answering some questions, filling out a form, things like that. So although we provide input into it, we only have so much into it. We kind of get stuck into a box based upon the questions that we create. And then of course we have the content where we are creating content for ourselves under a persona, whatever that may be. And so this would be Elliot's content created by Elliot in the roles. Now there's been many roles, several other roles added, but actor, writer, director, producer, the various things that Elliot has worked on under both personas and both identities, and then what's been added at what time period. So the data created by Elliot about Elliot. And then of course we have the data that's created really by others. So this could be data that includes software that's creating data, including how search algorithms make decisions about what it shows about Elliot, what people are writing about the Elliot, reviews and articles and things like that. How Elliot is cited in resources, so how Elliot is cited in movies and other things they may be working on if input from Elliot has not been taken into consideration. So how Elliot would appear as a documented identity within these various resources, especially if Elliot really didn't have any decision making in that particular piece of it. And so we kind of have these buckets of identity data. We have what's created by us that is more system oriented. We have what's created by us about us. And then we have content that's created or data that's created by others about us. And so, even when we Google or we, go out and look for information about ourselves, it includes a mix of, depending on if you've done anything, but, if you have a Twitter or social media or whatever, that will eventually show up in Google someplace. If you've done any presentations, that shows up in Google someplace. So you will see that mix of content about yourself, and then you'll see, content you've created and content others have created. So content others created, maybe there's, if you've purchased something, if you were in a newspaper article, if you went to an event and you were recording as an event participant, all of that kind of stuff falls into that category of things created about us. So a few attributes, when we think about the attributes or characteristics of Elliot that have changed since 2020: gender, name, resource, creative, and output. So Elliot has continued to work and done different things. So there's been additions to that. So that we get to that extensibility. How do we continue to maintain identity data to keep it up to date? Roles. So again, there's been additional roles added to Elliot's suite of roles. And by roles, I don't mean an specific acting role, though certainly there's those too, but I mean additional professions or job types of roles. Now, if we want to get even more granular and talk about specific roles within acting, specific roles within directing, then certainly there's even more levels below that too. So for the purposes of kind of talking about the ethical piece of this and kind of talking about the ethics of identity management, I just want to focus on the two attributes. And there's probably more attributes that have changed about Elliot, because this has been, a very public transformation, and there's been a lot of there's a lot of articles and videos and all kinds of things. So there may be other things up here besides these. I just kind of picked big general buckets of things that I knew about this particular situation. But, for the purposes of kind of looking at it through the ethics, I want to focus on the more personal parts of it, because I think that's where we really um, we really have struggled in terms of how much to include about very personal information about people and very identifiable information about people versus that privacy aspect. So certainly, what additional roles have they had? I mean, I don't think there would be any, you know, what, it's probably not going to be any question about whether or not you should add those, unless the person for some reason, it was just, I don't know. They walked off the set and said it was terrible and they weren't going to finish it, and they were suing or whatever. In that case, then maybe that would be one that would fall under the questionable category. But for the most part, if we've completed a work, if we've worked on a particular resource, and it's publicly available and everybody kind of knows that it's publicly available, there's that contract that comes into play. So just like with a book that's published, there's also the contract, of course, that comes in for media production for things that are commercially published. And commercially published for the purposes of kind of thinking about it through identities and contracts, we can also include independent films, things like that, really any formal process. Things that would not, media that would not fall into that category would be things like home movies. So if there were some home movies that, or, individual, someone else's cell phone videos. We've seen this over the years where someone's cell phone videos gets leaked, and then somebody who is in that video did not consent at all to have that content published on the internet, or any of that kind of stuff. And of course, it's not only a terrible invasion of privacy, but in some cases it's just straight up illegal what's happened. So for our purposes, for this discussion, we're really going to focus on gender and name. And we're going to talk much more about data sources, and we're going to dive into really looking at data sources. But I wanted to talk a little bit about kind of look at Wikidata and look at name authorities and kind of talk about the difference. Wikidata typically does not connect identities together to the extent that we do within Library of Congress name authorities. Now you will notice in the Wikidata page, there's also the also known as, so that's how they sort of treat differences in names or variations in names. And, the information that it is included is coming from, what's publicly available. When we look at Wikipedia, and one of the things that's interesting about Wikipedia, especially for identities, is I would say go look at the history of changes, because especially with people who have changed names or changed political affiliations or been involved in some kind of controversy or whatever it may be, seeing the history of the changes that have been made and some of the discussion, and there's not a lot of discussion, but you can kind of read through the notes and kind of see where there was some discussion that happened, can be really interesting to kind of see how we as a community of practitioners, so Wikidata feeds into Wikipedia. So Wikidata is kind of the authorities piece of Wikipedia. But in terms of the written content, seeing that history of changes, I think can be really interesting to kind of look at it for identities specifically. And you can also look at this in terms of like institutions and organizations to see that history. Now, the history is only there if someone has made changes to it. So it is a very collaborative sorts of process. So for example, if the Ford Motor Company, no one had ever made any changes to that page, and they have, but if they had not, then we wouldn't see anything really related about, how the name changed, or whatever was written there would just be sort of the source. But one thing that we've struggled with in terms of identities is sort of this representation of how much information to include about these personal sorts of issues. So in 2020, there was a little bit written. 2022, there was a little bit written. In 2023, it changed. So it kind of changed a little bit in terms of the organization. For one thing, they made it a little bit more sequential, where it starts with early life and education kind of at the top, and then it sort of goes through career very chronologically. So they changed sort of the formatting of Wikipedia, which then of course changes sort of the information that you see about the person, as opposed to um, a little bit different in terms of the presentation and the layout, but a lot of the information is the same, although it's been rewritten. So then when you look at the history of the notes, and I didn't page through all the notes, I just picked kind of a snapshot to show you, there is discussion here of some of the attributes and some of the thoughts about them. So for example, at one point we used formally, and there was a change from born to formally, and then that was changed back to formally. So you know what we should do in terms of how we represent names and identities. And so we see this in other communities, a practice where they're struggling as a community to kind of sort through what's the best way, because there have been guidelines, kind of earlier in Wikipedia that said, do this, and then we're sort of, their practice is sort of evolving too. This is the public link data service from LC, which pulls directly from the name authority file. And it is, it's less focused on sort of that, we have in Wikipedia, we have sort of this contextual information. In Wikidata, we have something that's a little bit more like the Library of Congress name authorities, where it's the person's name, what their name is in different languages, a description that's getting to the roles that that person plays, and then their other forms of their language and some little bit more information, but it's really not the contextual information that Wikipedia includes. So what we include in the Library of Congress name authority file is much more like what you would see in Wikidata. And when we kind of look at this presentation, the variations are the name, or this would be in the Wikidata terms, they also known as, is cited as variants. And again, that's a authorities term. It just means a variation of a name. And we see here the inclusion of a middle name, sort of from a different time period in Eliot's life. If we look at Wikidata, they have actually changed that name. So we have that mismatch of information there. And it may come from the time period where the name change actually happened, or it may be an attempt to reduce the impact of sort of the appearance of having that dead name or that no longer name used. So in Eliot's case, because it was a public transition, I think that gives a little bit more flexibility, because we know kind of what Eliot has said, and there's a body of work that exists under both names. So we kind of have that, and we have that time period where the names have existed and where the names end. In our discussion of identities in terms of libraries, one of the biggest questions we've had in terms of ethics really is about gender. And this has been even up until the last year, where we are still unpacking and trying to make decisions on what to do with the gender of people. Do we include it? Do we not include it? How do we include it? And From 2013, which is about when RDA started, resource description and access, these are the rules for, or guidelines, they're called guidelines now, best practices for how we do descriptive metadata in a cataloging MARC record, but they can be applied to other communities of practice. You can use resource description access best practice with an institutional repository, with a digital archive. You can kind of use it with anything. They're meant to be more flexible than previous rules were. So that sort of launched, as kind of implemented in 2013. So for almost 10 years, we encourage the recording of information about gender. And when RDA, so RDA applies to the descriptive cataloging, but then it also applied to name authorities. And when the rules or best practices first came out, it was very adamant that you should include gender. It was not an optional element. It was very much you should include this. This was very controversial because, one, most of our records at that time, identity data at that time, did not include names, or included names, did not include gender. And also, we didn't always have that information at hand. And people really felt, catalogers, metadata practitioners, really felt that it was trying to force or encourage people to add data in that perhaps they should not be adding, or they did not have adequate documentation to do that, and they would be making assumptions of that data. And of course, we can understand how hurtful and harmful it can be to make assumptions about someone's gender or someone's race or whatever it may be. I mean, it's just not, it's beyond not good, right? It's harmful. And just not a good data practice. It can really, when we start going back to the problems with data, it can really interject inconsistency in unintentional errors by making assumptions. So as I said, when it first came out, it was, do put gender in. And then after this giant uproar from the community, then it was, well, you can put the gender in, but you should have some guidelines. We're going to put some guardrails on this. So do add the gender, but we're going to put some guardrails in place. And we want it to be in a dedicated field. So we want gender to be a field that is easily searchable and indexable by a system that would be using this identity data. So that was sort of the take for quite a while, and for gender to use a subset of the thesaurus for the Library of Congress demographic group terms. That was felt that was the best selection of terms to be able to choose gender. Now, we're not choosing gender. We have, as I said, there were some guidelines put in place, some guardrails put in place so that we would not be making assumption. And one was, do not dig for given names or genders assigned for birth. So don't go do research. So we went from kind of do add this information to very quickly, I would say. It was a very quick turnaround to no, don't go looking for names or given names to try to determine gender. Don't go looking for genders. Don't try to figure this out on your own. Do not look at photographs of people or names and try to assume gender. Now, I mean, you would think, who would do that, right? But somebody would, because there was that initial push to add genders. So what we came to, which I think was useful, say I want to find all women authors in the 20th century. Well, how do I find that if that information is not included in the data somewhere? I really can't, right? So the guidelines were record gendered pronouns according to the term the person uses or what's in the source. So that kind of gave a little bit of an outing that you could kind of make an assumption based upon the resource itself. So, if the person's gender changed between the time you're cataloging this thing and creating the identity resource and the time that, the publication happened, so there was not a way for them to fix that publication, then there would be a mismatch between, information you're putting in based upon the resource itself and what that person is now calling themselves, because you were not to do research, in that way. The idea, of course, it was to try, I think it was a good attempt, but we need to go a little bit more. The idea was we're not trying to out people. We're not trying to expose anyone's personal preferences about anything. So, we're not trying to embarrass anyone or to out anybody or, cause harm to anyone by including this information. But we still did prefer to include gender and also to trace or include the previous versions of the name. So that was the other part of it, which doesn't get talked about enough, I think, is that it was not only that the preference was to include gender, but it was also include the previous name. So just recently, or recently-ish, we kind of have revisited that. We're going to talk about that in just a second. I think these questions are always going to be valid in terms of trying to balance, and this is in this gender recommendation document. I think this is always going to be some very valid questions to ask anytime you're trying to balance, does including this information benefit our users versus hurting our patron or hurting our content creators? And we always want to, I think, err on the side of protecting, just as we protect our users, protecting our content creators and our resource creators. But I think there are some caveats in there. Are they still living? If they're still living, then I think we need to have the conversation with that person if we can. If we can't have the conversation with that person, then I think we're much more cautious about what we include, and we don't include personally identifiable information. So, is there potential for this information to harm the person through outing or violating their right to privacy? Again, thinking about some of the photographs and some of the things we might encounter in archive, the person's still living, I think they need to have some say in what their identity looks like that we're creating for them, that we're crafting based upon their lives. Is there an indication this person consents to having this information shared publicly? Well, in Elliot's case, there's Wikipedia entries, but those Wikipedia entries are actually cited and include citations that document some of the statements that are in that particular Wikipedia page. So I would say in that case, there's there's the interviews and conversations and things like that. There are certainly things that are being written by Elliot or shared by Elliot, either on their own social media or through other platforms that do provide that information. But I think this last question about, and will including this information help a library user in the search process? I think that's an important question, but it cannot be more important than all the other questions here. We really need to consider our content creators, especially as we continue down this road of identities and especially more living people who may be represented in our collections. Unfortunately, this is just vague enough that you could misuse it if you maybe wait this last one. Maybe that's the question you really focus on and you sort of don't, well, they have a Wikipedia page, so I'm not outing them. And, including this information really helps the library user. But maybe their Wikipedia page doesn't include gender or any mention of their gender or any mention of a transition or any mention of a name change. And yet you've sort of done it by weighing the fact that there's something public out there about them. So I think it's just vague enough. I think these are good starting points to this conversation. I think they're just vague enough that they could be interpreted in a way that could be, or weighted in a way that could allow for misuse. The other thing I think this does is it does put a lot of weight and burden on those of us who are creating authority or identity records or data. We have to kind of really think through this. Now, I'm okay with that. I actually feel like that's an important, really, really important piece of the work. It's not just getting the name right. It's not just getting the birth date right, or it's not just getting their whatever profession right or whatever. It's really taking responsibility that you're creating this data about this person in a very ethical way, and that they have a say in that particular identity you are then crafting for them. Now, if they're dead, no longer with us, I think that's a little bit different situation. Certainly there may be some situations where we're talking about pseudonyms or alternate identities, things like that, where there may need to be a consideration, is this going to not be good for, say, the legacy of this particular person or their family? But I still think that's in some ways a little bit easier situation because you're not dealing with a living, breathing person who is going to be potentially very much impacted by the decision you made. So 2022, actually towards the end of 2022, we sort of said, no, we're not going to do any of that. Don't record the element for gender anymore. And if you come across it in a record, so this is for Library of Congress name authorities, which end up in the virtual internet authority file as well, you're going to delete that. So we're not going to use a 375 mark field to put that information in. So it can't be searched anymore in that way. And we're not going to record it anymore. And if you want to use it elsewhere in the record, maybe in the description of the person, we want you to kind of think about it. And I've given you some links there to some guidance that if you want to read up on that a little bit more. I'm not sure this is the best approach either, because it seems to me like we're saying this was too hard to do. So you know what, we're just not going to do it at all. I don't know that that's a good approach either. And I'm not trying to give a hard time to either Library of Congress or the Program for Cooperative Cataloging, which is PCC. They're fine folks. I know many of those folks. I've contributed to doing name authority work, identity management authority work. I'm slow at it because I'm very, very cautious at doing it. So I know that there was a lot of thought that went into this, and I can see the argument that we may be causing more harm than good by including that information. But the thing is, although we're not including gender, you know what we still include? We still include the variation of the name. So, when we look at, I got to go way back. When we look at this, although we're not including gender, we are including information about that person's name, which in some situations may imply gender. Now, not always. I mean, there are certainly gender neutral names. I've got one, and I actually kind of love that. But that is something that for some names they have very strong gender norms for some names, and so still including the name. And then if you have could be the other way around, a feminine to masculine name or whatever it may be, or the person's changed their name for some other reason, but we've still included, at least when we're having the conversation about gender, we have still included the variation of the name. So I think we need to have that conversation as well, about it's not just the name itself, it's also the previous identity associated with that person. And that to me is the piece that's missing in our conversation of late. We got very focused on gender, and I can understand that, but we also did not then continue that conversation, and hopefully it is continuing in various committees and arenas this year, that we need to continue to have the conversation because it's not just the gender that's a potential issue. We can, in an RDA record, in a Library of Congress name authority file record, and a national authority file, they're kind of the same thing, those two. National authority file is part of the Library of Congress name authority file. We can put someone's address in that record. And you may say, oh no, not the address. Exactly. Now, if I'm a faculty member and I have a faculty mailbox, it's in the classics department office, and it's a kind of more or less like a post office box, and I go in every day and I pick up my mail, and there's 100 other faculty members there and we all have a slot. Maybe I want to put my address in my identity record because I would feel comfortable with mail going to that address. Maybe I have a post office box that's associated with my name, and I would be perfectly comfortable getting mail in that post office box. Then, that is still an element or an attribute that can be included in that data, and maybe that should be something that is considered. But, there is also the potential that maybe I put the faculty member's office, and his office is a room number, and it would be very easy for someone to find it. And, that could potentially jeopardize or put him in harm. So I think we need to continue this conversation. It does not start with gender. It does not end with gender. That is just one part of the attributes about personal information that we need to talk about. We need to talk about names and how we connect identities together. We need to talk about address. We need to talk about all these different aspects of things. And people need to have a say in what they want their identities to be. When my name authority file was set up, I worked very carefully with the person. There's some information, including my address, that I would not want to have in my authority record, just because I've had some incidences, and I just, things I want to control for privacy's sake. And, then I looked at my authority record, it's probably been 4 or 5 months ago, but not only is there a typo in it now, so somebody updated and put a typo in it, but, they've added a whole bunch of workplace information to my my identity record, which is okay with me because I no longer work in those places, but it did concern me a little bit that someone had made all these changes. And at the time that, my identity record was set up, I was very clear that I didn't want any place that I was currently employed to appear in that record. And I didn't want any employee information to appear. I didn't want anybody to be able to connect me to institutions, not because I'm embarrassed about any of the institutions I'm worked in, but that is public information that is out in the wild. It is on the internet. And there's enough identifiable information in that record about me in terms of what I've written, that, and who I am on social media and stuff, that it would be clear for people to be able to find me without being able to track down my history of my employers, say for identity theft purposes. So, now I've got information kind of out there in my identity record that, I would kind of like to have removed, because no one asked me about that. The person who originally worked with me on this record did. So there's what the field looks like. We've moved entirely to omitting or removing the gender entirely from our data. Again, I think this is a little bit of, it's not going to solve the issue of protecting our content creators completely, because we still need to have some discussions about these other things, which I'm hopeful that we are starting to have. Wikidata has also been addressing gender. I've given you some links to things. There's a little bit more information under gender, at least. And again, we're just talking about gender because that's been sort of the the bulk of where our thought process has been on the library side of identity management. We've been very focused on these gender conversations, and I understand why. Um, but it is much more broad in terms of the whole landscape of our identities. So I wanted to, just because that has been such a hot topic, understandably, in libraries and identity management, I wanted to kind of then show you what Wikidata was doing. So this would be the Wikimedia aspect of it. So Wikimedia is the umbrella, Wikidata is under Wikimedia, and then Wikipedia, of course, is more the, like, the encyclopedia piece of it. So they have, I've given you the link here. It's part of their Wiki project, LGBT project. They have lots of different information. We'll be looking more at Wikimedia's some of their other work on identities next week, and we'll be talking through that and ORCID and some other things too. I think of interest in this discussion is the discussion of vandalism and how being a collaborative open project that, as they're trying to keep this information up to date, they are dealing with issues of vandalism and people trying to, well, just, do all kinds of things as people sometimes do in Wikipedia. So that discussion of vandalism that's linked there is really interesting because it really gets to, one, the challenges of having an open data project, and two, the amount of work it takes to maintain a project like this. So I'm actually kind of thinking like, oh, I should get involved in that project and help. We as librarians and people who are interested in this stuff, if you're not contributing name authorities and not able to do that at a national level, certainly you could get involved in Wikidata or some of these other projects, and you don't have to do a whole lot of work, but do what you can to kind of help that community too, because it does help us, it benefits us to have more authoritative sources besides the Library of Congress name authorities. It's a lot easier sometimes to get those name authorities or those identities put into Wikidata. So if you are not able to get your names, maybe you're doing a digital humanities project or a scholarly communication project, and you would like to get those names into some kind of national authority, into some kind of linked data, then Wikidata would be one of the projects that would be worthwhile looking at, because that would be a way to get those identities created. And we'll talk more about that a little bit as we kind of wrap up this class, like other places, like how you can get your names into these projects. But Wikidata would certainly be one to look at. LC has kind of given some guidelines on what would be called dead names. So when a person no longer uses their name, it's really kind of recorded. I mean, that's the basic of it. They give you some, select the preferred name, but then, it's basically record it someplace in the record. It doesn't need to be part of their preferred name or the name that you see when you're searching, but it should appear, just like when we looked at Elliot's page, it should appear in that record. Wikidata, again, as I mentioned here, just in case you didn't know what it was, authorities for wiki projects. And I've given you a little bit of one of the quotes from Wikidata, which I thought was really interesting about, how they're looking at gender and sort of what the preference has been sort of through their data as a whole, and what the assumption is about the information that's presented and things like that, which I think is, I think it's worth a read in terms of looking at that. They do have some very specific guidelines, and one of the guidelines that I think is really important is that if the person was not notable, so if there was nothing really published about that person under their dead name or their previous name, not to include it at all. So they really are trying to have a much more nuanced approach in terms of thinking about names. So they are still including gender, but again, that would be something that would not really, they're not going to unless that entry changes itself because that person already had an entry, like Elliot, they had an entry and then that entry got updated. So at that point, there would be that track of changes. But, if that person was did not have a Wikipedia entry previously or any information out there publicly available, there wasn't anything really created about them, they hadn't published or acted or whatever under their former name, then you aren't to include it. And of course, the gender would not be traced at that point either. And they give some other, you know, other information to kind of guide people in the process. And I think this would be helpful for us rather than just saying like, use something from the thesaurus and here's some questions to ask yourself, to have a little bit more of a nuanced conversation about not only gender, but this whole larger issue of what to do when someone's name changes, because it's not necessarily always tied to gender. It can also be a safety issue, or someone gets married, divorced, whatever it may be. I mean, there's so much more that happens besides just someone transitions gender and changes their name. Certainly that, I mean, Elliot was kind of a big, Elliot and Caitlyn Jenner, they were both big, very public cases where there was, a lot of media about it. So there was a lot of discussion about those cases. And certainly there are people that it happened to who are not published and who are not publishing, and, how their information is tracked in other resources, really isn't that much of a concern to us unless we need to use or access those resources to look at them. But I think Wikidata is trying to have that more nuanced conversation and, starting to look a little bit more even beyond like just gender as an attribute itself, but how gender connects to naming conventions and sort of cultural conventions too. So it's really interesting to kind of see, because I'm not saying that Wikipedia by any means doesn't have bias or any of that other kind of stuff, because it sure does. But I do think they're trying to look at it in a more nuanced way. So as we've talked about here, identity is really complicated. I mean, it seems like in some ways it wouldn't be. It's like, well, it's just data, and then it's just data that we put in based upon the information that we have. But then when we start to think about that data and start to think about what we should do with the data about the creators and the publishers and the editors and the illustrators and all of the people that are in the resources and connected to the resources that we collect and the data we created about those resources, it gets much more beyond certainly the privacy piece of it. We have a history of, not treating people equitably. I mean, we're still not quite there. We're having a lot more conversation about that and how we can remediate our data. Certainly we see it with subject headings where, women astronauts is a term, and then astronauts. So, the assumption is, the implied assumption is that astronauts are typically male if we're going to subdivide by women or have that as a category within astronauts. So I think we're starting to have a more nuanced conversation, and this does get to the identity piece as well of, when we are looking at identities created, especially when we start looking at the challenges of creating identities for historical people that are in the works that we digitize or the works that we're working with, it does get very complicated. I was talking to a colleague just a couple of weeks ago, and there was a situation where they were creating a name entry, and I encountered this when I worked on the archives a lot, where the person is listed as Mrs. Jones. And then it's like, well, do you put the person's first name in there, or how do you list them according to follow what the convention was at the time that they were publishing, what's on the resource itself in terms of how you create the identity. And then of course there's how you describe the resource itself. And for RDA, the resource description part of it for the metadata is you transcribe it as it appears on the resource. So if it says, diary by Mrs. Jones, then that would be what you would put for the title and the author. But then for the identity piece of it, we could put the person's name, Jones, comma, Verda. And then as a variant of that name could be the Mrs. Jones piece of it. So there are projects out there in Wikipedia and some other communities where they are starting to look at creating more entries, so creating more content, creating more identities for specific categories of people who've been underrepresented before. And certainly that gets to the ethics of what we're doing as well. So it's not just about, whether or not we are handling people's personal identifiable information with care, and we're making careful decisions about what data to record about them that would be personally identifiable, but also then especially we're looking at our collections and whether or not we have data where, maybe it says, there are 14 authors, but it says Jim Brown and 14 or 13 others, or et al. Was what it used to say. In olden days, we used Latin instead. And maybe the other 13 authors are women and they're not listed anywhere in there. Or they could be a completely different demographic group, but they're just not represented anywhere within that data of that particular record, because in the olden days, we just would count however many authors they were, or use et al. And we wouldn't list all of those or even give them each an identity or link to an identity. So, our data kind of has some of these same issues where we haven't always, from an identity standpoint, we haven't always been equitable in our treatment of representing all the names within a resource, or even with authors. There may be authors all listed on the title page, but we're not even representing all of them. We're just lumping them in as et al. And so they're not even visible within our data at all. So we have some of these same issues, and we're certainly looking at it. Many of us are looking at these kinds of projects to kind of make our data more representative, which of course then will help provide more access to our resources and hopefully make more findability for our resources too. But Wiki Project is doing the same sort of thing. Wikipedia is doing the same sort of thing to look at how we can do things. Of course, this is a lot of work. As I said, I'm very cautious and slow when I do identity work. It's rarely quick for me because I do think through all these things when I'm doing this kind of work. But I think it's important, and it's important work. And it is now on the internet, it is another source of information about that person. So we want to make sure that we create thoughtful and ethical data, because these are people, and especially living people. I think more so than anything, that we want to be very careful about those people, but we want to consider all the attributes carefully and really weigh whether or not including that data, the value of including that data, whether or not it's okay to include that data with the person. And including that data, of course, means that increases the findability of it, against whether or not this would be potentially harmful or against that person's wishes. So I would also add that part of it too. I think we really need to have the conversations with our creators, illustrators, those, content contributors. And I have seen some forums that have come out where you can send this to, an author. You can send it to someone who's in a photograph in a digital archive and say, like, here's what we have. Is this okay? And I think that's a really good idea. It doesn't have to be anything elaborate. It could just be a form letter of like, we have this, from you, and this is the information we have. Is this okay? Yes, no, or what changes would you like to see? And at least that way, if they don't give you information back and you go ahead and do it. Well, at least you tried, right? And I would still be careful, but at least you have given them the opportunity to say something. And then of course we always want to review standards, stay up to date on this changing landscape. It is a very dynamic changing landscape because of course we are all becoming more and more aware of privacy, the impact of living in this digital world, of having all these identities out on the web. And I would think about, depending upon what you're working in, what system you're working in, what your work is, what your workload is, but are there projects you can do to either contribute to a identity project, an identity source, either the name authority file, and I'll talk a little bit more about how to contribute to that, or if you can work on, help out Wikidata a little bit. If you can work on some of these Wikipedia projects where they're trying to create more content. There's so many ways that we can contribute, and it doesn't have to just be, I just showed you the wiki project women, but there's a wiki project for all kinds of things. There's even geographical areas where they're trying to get more content about them. So this is a great way for us to kind of really help the world in a different way, and it benefits us in the fact that, especially the Wikidata side of it, we are creating those resources then we can use for some of our projects. So people are fluid. We change jobs, we change everything, right? I mean, the fact that we have been so tied to static data to me has a lot to do with the fact that we've had to maintain it locally. And so because of that, we've just really locked ourselves into, we create an identity, we create this authority record, and nobody wants to update it. I mean, we do update it. We will add dates when somebody dies, but you know what? That's not even required. That is kind of well, you don't have to, because we recognize the work that it would take. And then when that date gets added in a name authority file, anybody who has that entry should update the data in their library catalog. So it makes work for libraries all across the world whenever an authority record changes. So it is a monumental obstacle to being able to maintain dynamic data about dynamic people. So my philosophy, be a data steward, don't be a scribe. Sometimes we have to be a scribe. We just have to record what we are working on, describe it as best we can, and move on. But really, when you're thinking about identities and you're thinking about people, assume the I want to do no harm philosophy. This is an area that we can do something that's really worthwhile and important work. Ask and don't assume. If you're not sure, don't make an assumption, but I think it's okay to reach out, and I think it's more than okay. I think we should be reaching out to our content creators more and the people who are represented in our archives more to see if they're okay with things. You can omit, edit, or redact information if requested. I am perfectly okay with that. Some people are not, but I think if our content creator comes to us and it's like, I just had this terrible thing happen to me and I'm going into the witness protection program and please take my name out of everything, then by golly, we should do it, right? I mean, we don't want that on us if something bad happens to someone because of our data. So I think people are more important than data in that way. And then of course, be ethical and consider, the bias, and consider where we can do some work to also help to make our data more equitable in terms of representation. Our collections aren't always equitable in representation, but we can do what we can to at least help where we do have areas that provide representation, but no one knows about them because those particular people are not represented within our works. And on that note, thank you all. Have a good rest of your week, and I will see you next time.